Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode on White David Gardening and Worm Farm. Today, we are going to be discussing worm farming. So, if you have questions about worm farming, please feel free to ask, and I will be asking some questions as well. Okay, silence the sky. Hi, Han White. How are you? Okay, so this is a question that a lot of people ask regarding worm farming, whether or not you can feed worms acidic food. That answer depends on how much acidic food you're going to be feeding your worms. Worms don't do so well with acidic food or in an acidic environment, but if you're feeding them small amount, then yes, they can eat acidic food, but you don't want to have so much in the bin that it is going to make the bin acidic, because then your worms will either die or escape from the bin. Now, do worms eat animal dung? What do you think? Worms do? Oh, Ixian, worms do eat animal dung, but then you have to be careful. So, are animal dung dangerous to worms? Yes and no. It depends on what state it is in when it is fed to them. So, apart from things like rabbits and chicken, the topic is worm farming. So, we're just asking questions relating to worm farming. And if you have questions relating to worm farming, then you're free to ask. I will do my best to answer. Hello, everyone. I know there are some of you that I can't see that you're here, but thank you all for joining me. So, the question that I was asking is whether or not worms can eat animal dung and if it is dangerous for animals, for the worms, that is. And the answer is yes, worms can eat animal dung, but you want to ensure that the dung that you're feeding your worms is properly composted before feeding it to the worms. And the reason is because animal dung contain a lot of nitrogen, which can make your bin overheat, and that will kill your worms. So you have to be careful of that. Now, if you cut worms in half, do they become two worms? Because a lot of time you hear people say if you cut them in two, they become two worms. Yes, they do. They eat any dung, human or animal, but you have to make sure you compost it before you feed it to them. Oh, hi, her healthy home. How are things with you today? Right. So, if you cut a worm in two, will it survive or will it become two worms? Okay, thank you. Well, the truth is no, it does not become two worms. It take a while for the last or the back end of the worm to die, but it does not become two worms. Hi, Russell. I heard that covering a worm with soil kills it. Is that a myth? No, because worms naturally live in soil, so that will not kill it. Right. So, as you rightly said, Russell, worms have only one head. They cannot regrow their head. So, if you cut them in two, they may or may not survive, but they will not become two. If you cut them where they still have all their vital organs attached to the head portion of the body, then that part will survive and they will regrow the whatever segment they have lost. But if you cut them in two, they will not become two worms. Can you tell where the head is? Yes, you can tell where the head is by one, observing the direction that the worms move, or if it is a mature worm, then it will have a clitellum close to its head. And three, some worms, their head shape different from their tail or their back end. So those are some of the things that you can use to identify where the head is, but it's not always easy, especially if it is a young worm and it's not really moving. Hi, Princess Lillian. Right, so let's see. Can compost worms live in water? Yes and no. Worms breathe through their skin. They do need moisture in order to breathe. So they need some amount of moisture. They can actually live in a large quantity of water, but only if that water is being aerated on a continuous basis, because that will provide the worms with oxygen when you're aerating the water. So in that case, they can survive. Let's see. When you say that clitellum word, it always makes me think of a child finding out too much information. Yes. Oh Lord, that's funny. Um, it does sound that way. Yes, so they can survive in water only if you're aerating that water on a continuous basis. So um, if you just put them in a container with water and there is no aeration taking place, then they're going to drown because they're not getting enough oxygen. I initially heard that you could not have them in water at all, but then I tried them in my hydroponic system that I had, and the worms survive. And in fact, those were the fattest worms I've ever had. So they can survive, but the water that you have them in has to be aerated. Oh, thank you, Princess. Okay, yes, I agree with you. There is so much to learn from gardening. It is actually very exciting. And the good thing is that you never ever stop learning, and there are always new method of doing things. And even though there are new methods of doing gardening, the old method works pretty well too. In fact, I actually think a lot of the older ways of gardening is a whole lot better because there was less chemicals, there was less disturbance of the soil. There were so many things dif- that was different. So I actually like the old way of doing it. But with the new changes, we learned so much more about interplanting and how to deal with pests and stuff like that. So it is pretty good. Okay. Now, what is the ideal? Sorry, do you read books on gardening and worm farming? No, I don't. Um, I do watch a lot of videos, well, used to, and well, Those, for my supporters, I do watch their videos so I can learn from them, or I do research online. But to take up a literal book and read, I don't do a lot of that because growing up until my early 20s, once I'm not doing anything, there was always a book in my hand. So I think I'm all read out. So no, and then, as you know, I am one of Jehovah's Witnesses. So we constantly, every day we read something. So if I don't have to take up a book outside of that, then no. Okay, so what is the ideal pH level for worms? Because as you know, worms do not like acidic environment. So the ideal pH for worms is between 6 and 7. That is very alkaline, close to neutral. So that is the best pH for worms. Is nitrogen harmful for worms? Yes. In large amounts, it can be harmful for your worms because nitrogen produces heat, and the heat will either kill your worms or cause them to escape from your bin. So too much nitrogen can be harmful for them. Why are red wigglers the best composting worms? Red wigglers are the best composting worms. One, because of their rate of reproduction. One red wiggler can give you 28 worms in 3 months. There is no other composting worm that reproduce at that rate. And White, don't understand your question. Right, so because of the rate that they breed, then that makes them the best composting worms. They are more tolerant to changes in the conditions around them, like the temperature, the moisture, and stuff like that, than the other composting worms as well. And the rate at which they eat. So these things make them more ideal than the other composting worms. Are worms male or female? Who can answer that question? Worms are actually hermaphrodites. You said red wigglers are the best composting worms. Yes, because of their rate of reproduction. So because they increase so much in numbers, and because they are so good at tolerating drastic changes in, they're better at tolerating drastic changes in the environment and the condition around them than the other worms. So that is what make them actually better composting worms. The one of the benefits though of using worms like the night crawlers is because if worm is eating their body weight in a day, then based on the size of the worm, then they can really eat a lot of food, but then they don't increase in numbers as much as the red wigglers do. They are both. Yes, worms are hermaphrodites. I think European night crawlers are the best. Okay. Yes, worms are actually hermaphrodites. But the interesting thing about being hermaphrodite with these worms is that not only are they hermaphrodites, so they don't have two sex organs. They have 1 minute they may be female. So if there are a lot of male in the bin, then they will just switch their sex to female, or if there are a lot of females, they will switch their sex to male, so that because the two worms, although they're hermaphrodites, they need to join together in order to reproduce. So based on their needs, they will change their sex. So it's not that they have two different sex organ at the same time. Now, what can you do to cool your worm down on a hot day? One, you can put them somewhere in the shade. You can, if they're indoors, then you can turn up your AC. Can be a bit expensive for that. You can turn a fan on them, but not too high. So putting them where they can get a good supply of air, you can open your bin, and this will help to cool your worms down. You can put a bit of water in their bin, but you don't want to put too much. Cool water, but not cold. Remember that composting worms do not like temperatures under 10 degrees, so you don't want to make the water cold for them, because if you make it too cold, then the worms will slow down for a bit until the temperature goes back up. Okay, how can you know how much worms you need to start your worm bin? This is a question that a lot of people who are interested in starting a worm farm will ask. And it's a very good one because there are so many factors that determine how much worms you start with. Like, what is the reason for using the worm farm? How much food are you producing? So, this is what you want to do if you want to know the ideal amount of worms to start with. If you are only going to be feeding your worms material from your kitchen, then what you want to do is save up the food scraps that you have for a week. You want to wait and keep in mind that worms eat half, up to half to their full body weight in a day. So if they're going to eat half to their full body weight in a day, and within a day you know that you are producing, say, half pound of food, then you know that you're going to need 1 pound of worm, because the worm is going to eat half their body weight. So if you produce half pound of food for the day, then you need 1 pound of worm to consume that. If you see, however, that your worms are eating their full body weight in a day, and most times they will not. So based on the amount of food that you are producing in your garden, in your kitchen, then that will determine how much worms you start off with. If, however, you're going to be feeding them things from your garden, leftover, like the plants, residue, or you're going to be getting material from your neighbors or so your surroundings, then based on the amount that you have on a regular basis, then that will determine how much worms you start with. Do you need a certain amount? I didn't know that. Well, it's not that you have to have a specific amount, really. If your aim is to control your leftovers or your food scraps so that you don't occupy a lot of space in the landfill, then it is important to know how much worms will consume the material that you are producing within a week. Because when you know how much when you know how much food you're producing, then you know how much worms you need in order to consume that material as quickly as possible, because you don't want to have the food scraps lying around for any extended period of time, because it will start to go bad. It's going to be breeding bacteria in your home and stuff like that. You don't want to have it in your freezer for a very long time either, because you're taking up space that you could be using to store food for your family. So then, having the right amount of worms to consume the food that you're producing is very beneficial. If you're doing it for the castings for your garden, then having a certain amount is important. If you start with less than a pound of worms, the chances are that you're not going to be producing the amount of castings that you need for your garden unless your garden is really, really small, like maybe 3 or 4 or 5 containers. So that is why the amount of worms that you start with is important. Can you feed them on cardboard and grass only? Yes, you can actually. You can feed them on paper only. You can feed them on grass only. If you're feeding your worms grass, you have to allow at least 2 days after cutting your grass to feed it to your worms. I would allow longer than that, than the 2 days, however, because, sorry, not 2 days, 3 days. In the initial stage of cutting your grass, it is very high in nitrogen, which can overeat and destroy your worms. So you want to put down the grass so that it dries out a little bit and lose some of the nitrogen, which usually occur within the first 3 or so days of cutting your grass. You can feed your worms on cardboard and grass because, one, cardboard is considered a brown, not because of the color, but because it is carbon based. You can feed your worm on the grass because of the nitrogen. But then, as I said before, you have to watch the level of nitrogen that is in your grass before you feed it to them. So, by providing the nitrogen and the carbon, you're providing a balance for them. Of course, they will not be as healthy as worms that feed on other food scraps because other nutrients would be missing from the diet, but they can feed, they can actually live off just that. I want to start saving my food scraps to make fertilizer. Okay, good. And if you want to make fertilizer and you don't want to do a worm farm, then you can just simply compost it. If you have a lot of growing space and you don't have a compost bin, you can actually select an area in your yard or in your garden that you're just going to be putting that food scraps in. Whether you're going to be putting it on the surface or you're going to be digging a hole and put the food scraps down in there and let it stay there. If you put it on the surface or dig a hole for it, then it will actually attract the regular earthworms and they will help to compost it faster for you. My worms have a lot more than they can eat in a year and growing. Yes, I did see quite a few of your videos of your worms. They're doing quite well. They do eat a lot and look so healthy. But I was lying in my bed this morning thinking, European night crawlers, I wonder if they're going to grow as big as yours. I don't know if they're going to get up to your size because England is their native home and they may not do as well outside of their native home. So I don't know if they're going to be as big as yours. And the truth is, I don't really want them to be as big as yours because although I handle worms, I'm okay with the smaller ones. The bigger ones, they're like a bit creepy. Yeah. Handling a few of them fine, but when I have a lot of them to handle, it's a bit creepy. Yeah, we'll see if I get used to that after a time. For now, they are still small, so I don't have to worry about that just yet. Yes, nitrogen does burn. Okay, you understand. Okay, can you feed your worms meat? Well, it is organic, so they will eat it. They don't have a problem eating it actually. The only reason why we are told not to feed meat to our worms. You used to feed them meat? Okay. Yeah, the only reason why we are told not to feed them meat is because, one, when the meat goes bad outside only, For the meat, okay, yes. So you can feed them meat outside. In fact, I have a bin that sometimes when my food goes bad, or if I have little leftover meat or stuff, I just put it in that compost bin and cover it up with a lot of soil. And occasionally I might put one or two worms in there. But in my regular compost bin, I don't put the meat, because one, when the meat starts to go bad, or because if it lasts more than a day, it will start to smell. So you don't want the odor. And two, it will definitely attract rodents. So if you have an outside bin that has small holes that rodents can't get in, and you have a lot of grass, shredded leaves, or stuff like that, that you can cover the meat to the extent where the scent is hard to get out, then yes, you can feed it to worms. But outside of that, I would not really, it's not recommended to feed your worms on meat unless you have a lot of worms and small amount of meat that you know for a fact that they're going to consume within a day, then that is fine. But if there's any possibility of the meat lasting for more than a day in your bin, then it's not worth it, unless it's outdoors where it won't bother you or the neighbors. But I no longer do so. Okay. Yes, I used to bury it. Okay. Yes. Do worms have teeth? No, worms do not have teeth. They have gizzard just like the chickens. So they don't have teeth, when which is why they don't really eat as fast. Let's see. No, yes, you're right. They do not have teeth. So how can you help your worms to eat faster or digest the food faster, since as they don't have teeth? Do they fight? I've never seen them fighting. No, I don't think so. But you can never know. Eh? But they're not like us humans who tends to fight for no reason. So I don't know if they fight. I've never seen that. Cut up the food. Oh yes, that is one method. So you can cut up the food. You can freeze the food and let it thaw, because then it will become soft and start to produce, the microbes will start to grow on it and the bacteria, and then they will be able to feed on it and digest it faster. You can give them eggshell, you can give them diatomaceous earth, or you can give them some fine grains of sand mixed in with the food, and that will help them to digest the food. So anything that is considered roughage, not from it, not roughage that we eat, because the roughage that we eat is not enough for them. It's not considered roughage for them. So the eggshell, the diatomaceous earth, and stuff like that, the sand grain, that will serve as roughage, that will help them to digest the food faster. I really can't bear the sight. That's one reason why I do a long term compost bin. Okay. I have been occasionally thinking about bokashi for meat and bones. Okay. Yeah, I've heard of that bokashi method of composting. In fact, I looked into it a bit, but then I don't want to be buying that, what was it, barley, or that grain that they use to break down the food scraps. I don't believe that I should buy anything to produce my compost. The whole idea of the compost is to reuse, of composting for me, is to reuse what I have, and if I can get more composting material from others, then fine. But if I have to buy material to use to compost, or to buy material to feed my worms, it's not going to happen. I will buy the worm bin I will buy the material to make the word shelving and stuff like that. But if I have to buy the food, no, it's not gonna happen. Okay, let's see. Can worms replace segments of their bodies that they have lost? I agree. That is why I think and not do. Okay, okay. Let's see what Princess says. You bury all meat and fish deep in the garden so you're not going to be turning it. Yes, that is true. That is true. But I wonder how long it takes for those to break down, especially if there are not a lot of worms around to help break it down. Speaking of which, I forgot. I buried some 3 years now that I was going to go back and dig to see what's happening with it because I'm always curious about that. I forgot all about that. No, I don't think I would find anything there. Okay, I bury meat in my garden. Okay, yes. But when you bury your meat in the garden, how deep do you bury the meat in the garden? Do you have a specific depth that you use? Uh, if I am burying meat in my garden, I like to go 2 feet. And the reason that I like to go 2 feet is because I don't want the rodents digging it up, and they can dig pretty deep sometimes. So I try to go 2 feet so that they won't get to it. So I don't really know if my plant roots are going down that deep for them to benefit from the nutrients. But yeah, deep enough so that the foxes won't get to it. Okay. You have foxes where you are? We have we have some here, but they don't come in the city. They are mostly on the acreages. Oh, very friendly foxes. That would be cool to see them up close and see what they would do. Okay, so can worms replace segments of their bodies that they have lost? Yes, they certainly can, but only if their vital organs are intact. So, as long as they don't damage their vital organs, they can replace whatever part of their bodies they have lost, but they can't replace any of their organs. So, if damaged, then they may die. Now, worms do not have eyes, so how do they know when they are to escape? How do they know that there is light around them? Well, these these worms, they have some form of sensor close to their head that they can use to sense light. So whenever there is light around, that is why you see them escaping, but it's not because they have eyes. And if the light produces heat, then they can sense that as well. They're very sensitive to any form of changes. Even a temperature change of 1 degree, they will know the difference. If you put light on them any at all, right away they respond. If any changes in temperature, any changes in vibration, anything like that, photoceptors, yes, that's the right expression for it. So anything like that, they can sense these changes as quickly as soon as it occurs. They can sense it, which is good because they're so delicate. It is necessary for them to protect themselves. In fact, if worms get exposed to light for 1 hour, they will become paralyzed. I don't know if within that 1 hour they will die, but if it stays for any long period after that, maybe several hours, they will definitely die. But 1 hour of exposure and the worms become paralyzed. Now, what is a common sign that your worm bin is too dry? The most common sign that your worm bin is too dry is ants. Once your worm bin is too dry and you have food scraps in there, yes, right on, princess. Once the worm bin is too dry, the ants will move in and start taking out the food scraps. So, a good way to getting rid of ants is using water. It's very simple, but it works pretty well. Um, so your worm bin, you want to make sure that it is not too dry because one, you're going to be attracting the ants and some other insects as well. But you're also going to be putting your worms in danger. And if your worm bin is damp but it does not have sufficient moisture that the worms require, then what is going to happen is that your worms will survive, but they won't look healthy. They will be thin, even though they have a lot of food. They still will be thin. So it is important for them to have a reasonable amount of moisture to keep them going. What is the average lifespan of red wigglers? I don't know if this applies to other worms because I don't grow other worms, and because I don't have other worms, well, no, I do. Because I don't really have other worms, I haven't really studied a lot about them, so I don't know what their lifespan is. But the lifespan of red wigglers is between 4 and 5 years. And now, for our final question, how can you identify an adult worm? I think I alluded to this earlier when our healthy home asked about the clitellum on the worms, or how you can identify the head of the worms. So you can identify a adult worm because of the clitellum that they grow. So close to the head of the worms, the clitellum will grow when the worm reach adulthood, and the clitellum is something like a ring or a thicker portion of the worm. It usually is a slightly different color from the body of the worm, and it goes all around the worm in one little section. So that is the clitellum. That is where the eggs are produced. And then, funny enough, the eggs, they lay their eggs from their head. So the membrane that is on the clitellum move forward towards their head, and then in that the cocoon is produced. Funny little creatures. Okay, so we have come to the end of this discussion. If you have questions, feel free to ask. Let's see. Oh, hi, Steve. I can't stay too long. I am cooking dinner. Hello, El. I just wanted to show my support. Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's nice that you were able to join us. It's supper time already over there, eh? Let's see. It is not it's not even 1 o'clock here yet. If you place 7 worms in a box, how many will it become in a year or so? Well, consider the fact that worms can produce three, sorry, can double their amount in 3 months. So if every 3 months so you start off with 7 months, 3 months later you have 14 worms, another 3 months later you have 28 worms, And then another 3 months, you will have 56 worms. And another 3 months after that, you're going to have 112 worms. So that is the amount of worms that you can have in a year if you start off with just 7 worms. And that is, of course, if none of the worms die. Also, that is on the lower end as well, because your worms, as I mentioned in the earlier part of the video, of the live, is that worms, one worm can produce up to 28 worms within 3 months. So when we are saying that the worm double in amount within 3 months, that is on the very lowest end. So you can have 28 times that amount that you start off with within 3 months. And every 3 months, you can have up to 28 times that number. So the exact amount, it's not something that is definite, but yes. So you know that at the very least, provided the worms don't die, you can end up with 112 worms within a year. Are you planning to start off with 7 worms? What type of worms would you use if you're composting, if you're vermicomposting? Are you thinking of vermicomposting? Would you use red wiggler? Would you use the any of the night crawlers, the blue worms? Okay, because someone was mentioning the number last time. Okay, I've got so many worms, I don't know what to do with them. Right, so yes, I know. I think it was Russell that was saying he has a system where he has he put 7 worms in a bin and run the experiment for 8 to 10 weeks, something of the sort. And every couple of weeks, he would start another bin with 7 or so worms, and then he would end up with half pound of worms, half pound of casting every 6 months. I think that's what you are alluding to. I was told that worms can double their population in 60 days. Oh, 60 days, eh? Yeah, but that makes sense too, because if they can have 28 times their amount in 6 months, sorry, in 3 months, 28 times, then it's natural that they can more than double their population in 60 days. Uh, there are conflicting information as to how long worms take to reach maturity. And I think the conflict in that is because for worms that are in very ideal conditions, they mature faster. Worms that are not in so much of an ideal condition will not mature as quickly. And then the worms that mature faster are going to be reproducing faster. So on that note, then the worms can reproduce up to 28 times within 3 months. So that is why the information is conflicting as to how long it takes for worm to reach maturity. There are numbers of factors that affects it. Let's see. I do regular compost with a mix of ANC, ENC, and red. Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I can combine those worms together because I sell my worms, and sometimes people might want just one variety and not the other, so I can't really put my worms together. But I hear that it is actually beneficial having the various type of worms together because some worms do good in one season or one type of weather. Other worms do better in another type of weather. So it kind of keep a balance when you have the various type of worms because it keeps production going, because when one slows down the other type of worm picks up the pace. So it is actually beneficial for that. But if you are going to be marketing your worms, then unless your customers want a combination of worms, then it's not pretty practical for me. My worms grow rapidly. Yes, I can see that because you said out of the eggs that you sent me, your worms actually are pretty big right now. Mine are still small. In fact, I think I've only seen two adults, one, and they're not fully adults yet based on how their clitoris looks. So I don't know if it has to do with the fact that they were in transportation for 3 months, so they may have been traumatized. I don't know if it has to do with the fact that you're feeding yours food scraps and I'm feeding mine on compost with occasional food scraps. So there are so many factors that may be affecting them. I don't know if it is because they are in a different country, so the barometric pressure here might be different from what they are used to in England. But mine are pretty small. They don't seem to be growing fast. I'm a bit disappointed with the rate they're growing, which is why I am running my experiment to see if feeding them food scraps will make them grow faster than feeding them compost. So I'm doing a comparison of the two to see which one works best. And if the food scraps work out to be better, then I will be feeding those ENCs on food scraps. Let's see. What are you feeding them? Yeah, okay. So what should I do when they outgrow my container? That's a good question. So the rule of the thumb is that you should have 1 square foot of surface area for a pound of worms. There are some people who will allow 1 square foot of surface area for 2 pounds of worms. You don't want to go over that though, because if your container has too much worms in it, then the worms are going to escape the bin, especially the adults one are going to leave the bin so that the younger ones can have a chance to grow. So if your worms outgrow your container, then you need to get another container and start a worm bin. If you don't want to have more than one worm bins, then you could either put the extra worms in your garden or in your outdoor compost bin if you have one. Or if you know of people who would like to have compost worms, or friends who would like to have compost worm, you can either sell it or share it with them. But usually, once your bin gets too crowded, then you have to separate, you have to divide the bin. Um, if your worms are reproducing at a faster rate than you would like them to, and you don't want to have another worm bin, another option that you have is you could slow down, you could control the condition in the bin so that the worms will reproduce less. So the more space the worms have, the faster they're going to reproduce because they know they have the space. The more food they have, the more they're going to reproduce. The only negative thing with this is that if you are raising the worms for the castings, then you're going to be reducing your production by reducing the rate at which your worms produce. So, at the rate at which your worms reproduce, so that might not be such a viable option. I think it might be. Okay, let's see. I distracted. Is that for me?
Handy share. So I'm saying I think might be.
Cheryl, look what I got.
It just came in the mail approximately 5 seconds ago.
I got your package.
Open it. I want my stuff.
Thank you. No, I'm not gonna open it. I have to do a review on it. Okay, so let's see. In March of this year, I have over 1,000 eggs. Whoa! And within a month, they were all hatched, and now I've got mature worms. Nice, very nice. I feed my worms food scraps. Okay,
Can you feed me instead of hungry?
food scraps work out best. Okay, I get your purpose. Is it sold to fishermen and or chicken feed? Or okay. Um there are different groups that will buy it. People who raise pets like anything in the lizard family will buy worms for that purpose. Fishermen will buy worms. Um, but mostly, I've never really had a fisherman or people. Only one person I've ever bought worms from me for pets. Pets. Usually, those that I supply to are people who want to start their own worm farm. Yeah, but because I think we have some pet stores here that sell worms for pets, and most people who want worms for fishing will go to one of those fishing shops that sell fishing supplies. So,
It's actually
yeah,
making it.
so most of who I supply worms are people who want it for composting. I think I need another worm bin for my worms. Really? You just started another worm bin a few months ago and you're already running out of space. That is interesting. My red wigglers eat my garbage. My night crawlers eat finely ground compost or worm peat. Worm peat. Okay. So that is interesting. So you don't feed the two of them the same thing then. That is interesting. Yeah, based on what Han White says, I think the ENCs or the night crawlers love the food scraps a lot. Thank you so much for this. It is a great help to me. Okay, you're welcome, Steve. You got it.
Minecraft, Steve.
Clean the package before you touch anything, especially your face. Don't worry.
I already did it.
Yeah, my Shen sterilized it before she brought it down, so it's good. Yeah, can't take any chances these days. Okay, one more question, then I have to get on with dinner. Are those tiered worms bin tiered worm bins better, or are the toads as good? The toads are actually as good as the tiered worm bins. Um, the tiered worm bins, I don't know. I've never used one. I have a tiered worm bin, but mine is completely different from the ones that I see out there because mine is 2 feet by 7 feet long and sits on top of the other one. So they're not directly touching each other. It's just I have 2 feet of space in between. So the two bins are not really touching each other. It's just the columns that holds them in place that's the only connection between them. So those stackable worm bins, they do work well. You feed from you feed the bottom and the worms compost what is in the bottom layer, then they move up to the next layer and you feed that layer. Then you can just take out the castings from the bottom layer and move on. Hi, Surya. Right, so you can just take out that bottom layer when it is composted and you just keep the bottom layer that you take out, you empty it, you clean it, you put it on the top and you just keep going. So it works, but I've never used it. But from what I have seen, a lot of reviews that I've seen from it, they do work. But the toads might be is more popular. So I don't know. It is. I guess it is up to you if you want to have the heavy material to lift, because the toads can get a bit heavy unless you have it where you don't necessarily have to lift it. Hi, Rodney. Okay, I think. I hope I answer your question, Steve. Yeah. So either of them works pretty well. The toad is more of a challenge to harvest than the tiered worm bins. But then if you want to harvest the toad the simplest way, then all you have to do is move all of your material in your worm bin to one side and then add your food scraps to the opposite side. The worms will, over a period of time, gravitate towards the fresh food that you put in there, and then you can just take out your castings. Of course, you're still going to have worms remaining in the finished castings because there is always traces of food scraps left in it, and they will stay behind. Some of them will stay behind to eat that, but the vast majority will move over to the food scraps that you had it after. Let's see. Your aunt says good one for sterilizing the
Yeah, I know. I
package.
saw it forever ago.
Okay. Thanks for that. Have a great evening, all. Keep well and stay safe.
You do
You too,
that.
Steve. Take care. Hey, have a great weekend. Okay, so what are you doing? Hold on, I just have to jot down a little point.
I have a question for Auntie Shirley.
Actually, I know nothing personal. Child, get away. Please stop that.
A ghost.
No.
A ghost.
The joke. Mm-mm.
Uh huh.
Mm-mm.
Uh huh.
We don't do that here. Anyway, let's see if I have any more questions. I see. Thank you. As you know, I am a novice and I missed your last two live chat. Thank you. You're most welcome. I'm glad that you were able to join us and that I was able to answer those questions for you. How do worm bins and chicken interact with each other? Well, that's a pretty good question. Your worms, the chickens do eat some of your worms and they do eat some of your food scraps. If it is a outdoor worm bin where the chicken have, say it's an open area that you have your compost that you have your worms in, then the chicken will eat some of your worms, but your chicken will also be dropping their dung in the compost bin, so the worms have that to feed on. So pretty much you can say it's a symbiotic relationship. The worms won't be able to eat all of, sorry, the chickens won't be able to eat all of your worms. But if you have a small amount of worms, then you might not want to have your chickens interacting with your worms because then it will drastically reduce your population. But if you have a large population of worms, then it is no big deal here or there whether they eat some of your worms. I would feel sorry for the for the worms though. Let's see. Okay, me too. I really have to go now. Bye. Okay, take care. Chick food. Okay, so keep them very much separated. Yes, that would be your best option because you have whatever it is that you're already feeding your chicken on, so they're not short on food. And while you're feeding them separately, you can always take the chicken dung and feed it to the worms. So either way, you're still benefiting from both. I'm making dinner too, multitasking. Yeah, I tend to do that a lot when I'm cooking. I'm always watching YouTube while I'm cooking, or at least if I can't watch, then I listen.
I have TV on and sitting in the room with it on mute.
Okay.
I just
Yeah, so anyway, guys, if you don't have any more questions, then I am going to sign out. I'm happy that you were all able to join me. Hope this information is beneficial for you. Let's see. Our bins, let's see. Our bins be outside, how about season? Are you asking if your bins can stay outside during all the various season? That depend. If that's what you're asking, if that's what you're asking, then it depends on where you are and the type of season that you have, in terms of hot and cold, how wet it is, and stuff like that. So, if you have areas where your temperature is going to be 10 degrees or lower, and that's 10 degrees Celsius or lower, then it is not ideal for worm bins to be outdoors. It would be good to have them within in an heated area, whether in a basement or in your kitchen. You can actually keep your worm bin underneath your kitchen sink if you have space. Or if the temperature is going to be super hot, then you also have to be careful because the worms will try to escape the heat. So the good thing is that if it is hot, you might be able to move your worm bin to a shaded area to cool it down. But if it is too cold, you can use a thick blanket depending on where you are. But in places where freezing is going to occur, they have to be indoors. So whether heated garage or in your house, then it has to be somewhere where they are warm. See, yes, that's what I'm asking. Okay. Mine are always outdoors and I live in England. Okay. Some worms do better in some environments than others. So some worms will prefer the cooler environment, some will prefer the warmer environment. Some worms can tolerate a bit of both differences, but not too much. So, depending on where you are, one of the things that you have to consider is not just hot and cold, you also have to consider if you get a lot of rain, because if the rain is getting in your bin, then you're going to have a problem. So, if you can have your bin and have it covered, then it's fine, because then too much moisture won't be getting in there. If the moisture is getting in there, but the moisture can drain quickly without making your material muddy or too wet, then it's fine. But yeah, you have to know what season you're in and how cold or how hot it gets or how wet it gets in order to know whether or not you can keep them outdoors or indoors. Okay, so we have come to the end of our live. It was great that you were able to join me, and I hope to see you again Monday, probably around 5, 6 o'clock in the evening, where we'll be discussing gardening, some gardening question, and you can feel free to ask whatever questions you have. Thank you for this informative live chat. You're welcome, Russell. Okay, so all being well, I'll see you guys on Monday evening, Stay safe and have a good day. You're most welcome, Rodney. Same to you, Han White. Have a good weekend. Thank you. Bye, her healthy home. Mine stay outside and it is very big, so the worms stay in the middle. Oh, okay, that's nice. I guess they must reproduce pretty fast if your bin is very big. That's cool. Okay, stay safe. I am signing out now.